Welcome to Post Games, a podcast about how and why we love video games. My name is Chris Plant, and I am so happy to have you here. 44 years ago, Nintendo debuted its first of many beloved series. In Donkey Kong, you played as a little-known plumber named Mario, climbing ladders and leaping over barrels to best the titular villain. Now, for a time, it did seem like Mario and Donkey Kong could both be stars. But after Donkey Kong's hit Super Nintendo series devolved into a notoriously irritating Nintendo 64 platformer, the bulky primate fell into the B-list. As more or less depicted in the film Wreck-It Ralph, Donkey Kong has long been shortchanged his moment in the sun. But this week, that changes. The same internal Nintendo studio that created Super Mario Odyssey has released Donkey Kong Bonanza. Critics love it. Nintendo fans love it. Post Games listeners love it. We have a pop-up convo thread on Patreon, and one commenter put it quite eloquently. Tofu Lover 412 writes, "Boy, do I love hitting stuff in this game." Tofu Lover 412, I can relate. But Tofu Lover 412, do you know there's something so deeply buried within Donkey Kong that no amount of hitting can reach it? A sadness, a darkness, a time of wandering. Listeners, Nintendo's internal game makers haven't made a traditional Donkey Kong game for nearly 40 years. After breaking Nintendo into the US, the gorilla got usurped by a certain famous plumber. We gotta fix that. This week on Post Games, the B-list history of a Donkey Kong. Gaming historian Jeremy Parish joins me for the entire episode to tell the story of gaming's most famous primate. Act 1, how Donkey Kong saved Nintendo. Act 2, Donkey Kong's long journey back to the top. A Patreon bonus, the top 5 Donkey Kong games, and the number 1 strangest. And, of course, Act 3, the news of the week. It is a hell of a show. If we wait any longer, I'll go bananas. It is a new year and you want to eat better, but you still have no time to work with. You have no energy. You have so much going on in your life. Oh, what do? You do Factor. 2 minutes, real food, and you are done. You're not failing at eating healthy. You're failing at having 3 extra hours in every night. You're failing at not being a chef and wanting to do cleanup. Factor takes care of that. It has delicious food that is good for you. You got lean proteins, colorful veggies, whole food ingredients, and none of the yucky stuff, no refined sugars, no artificial sweeteners. It will offer you whatever you need to match your lifestyle. For me, Mediterranean diet, it really works well. But maybe you need something else, like a high-protein diet or GLP-1 support or ready-to-eat salads. Whatever it is, Factor wants to meet you on your page. Always fresh, never frozen, and like I said, ready in 2 minutes with no prep, no cleanup. Just chill. I use Factor. I think that you should too. Head to factormeals.com/postgames 50 off and use code postgames50 off to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for a year. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and qualifying auto-renewing subscriptions purchase. Make healthier eating easy with Factor. Act 1. Donkey Kong, Nintendo's first superstar. Jeremy Parish is one of the longest active game critics and historians working today. He co-created the retro gaming podcast Retronauts in 2006, and it has continued for nearly 20 years. 11 years ago, he began the video retrospective series Video Works. Sub-series like NES Works and Seigaiden document the complete software history of classic consoles, chronologically, game by game. Not only does Parish preserve footage of the games, explaining their mechanics and development, but he also fills each mini time capsule with relevant industry and cultural context. In recent years, Parish has preserved the series in a less precarious format than web video. Books. Limited run games has published collections of Video Works essays for NES Works, Seigaiden, Super NES Works, and even Virtual Boy Works. Yes, Parish has thoroughly documented the history of Nintendo's least successful home console. Parish has made multiple videos of the Donkey Kong series and chronicled the entirety of the DK canon on various podcast episodes and gaming websites, all of which is to say, Jeremy Parish isn't an expert, he's the expert. So let's get into it. What had Nintendo released in arcades before Donkey Kong? What was its reputation?
Yeah, I don't know that Nintendo had a reputation in the US before Donkey Kong. They were trying to carve themselves a niche. And Donkey Kong actually came about because they were doing such a bad job of managing the US market. It was a disaster that they turned into a gold mine. But on the Japanese side of things, they were really just doing the same things that other companies in that space were doing, which is following the leader. They made breakout games. They made clones. They published, kind of remarkably, the first, I think, officially licensed version of Othello, which became a mainstay of Japanese consoles for decades. And of course, Space Invaders, Galaxian-type clones.
How does Donkey Kong come to be if they don't really have a reputation?
So Nintendo wasn't actually making its own video games. They were kind of involved on maybe the product design style, but the actual programming or really engineering at that point, those were done by external contractors, work for hire electronics engineers and that sort of thing. So really what happened was that a Space Invaders knockoff that they created called Radar Scope and shipped in Japan to moderate success. They said, oh, this was a pretty decent hit. We should take it over to the US. But the US never really got into Space Invaders in the way that Japan did. And also the logistics of freight shipping caused the shipment that they sent overseas to arrive way too late for it to matter in the US. And so arcade operators just had no interest in yet another Space Invaders clone. I mean, Radar Scope was cool in that it had a sort of fake 3D perspective and tilted the field, but it was still pretty much, if you'd played Space Invaders or Galaxian, you had played Radar Scope. And so they were left with, I think, like 2,000 units of this machine that just no one wanted to buy. For a relatively little company that had been struggling to find its place for the better part of a century at that point, 2,000 manufactured, unsold machines was going to be a disaster. They said, we need to come up with something really quickly, like to swap out into these machines, like a board we can put in there using the same technology and then just slap some decals over the side of the board. We've got to come up with something. So they famously commissioned a young artist working for the company who had previously done some product design work and some illustrations, Shigeru Miyamoto, to come up with a concept for a video game. And at that point, I believe they had aspirations to license Popeye and to make a Popeye video game.
I was going to ask about this because I've heard that they were outright making this as a Popeye game, but I don't know if that is apocryphal or not.
So I don't know what the exact timeline and story is with that, but I do know that Donkey Kong did begin as a Popeye game, and I think they were confident that they would get the license. They had done a lot of licensing, especially in Japan at that point. I believe They had done some Disney stuff. They had done some Snoopy stuff, if I'm not mistaken. So they were no strangers to licensing. And Popeye actually has kind of a fandom in Japan. There was a boys magazine called Popeye at the time. And I think Kate Willert dug up a magazine cover where there's like this kind of burly mustachioed guy in overalls on a cover of a Popeye magazine from like 1980 or 1979 or something. It's like, is this, like a coincidence? But for whatever reason, that license didn't work out. And it did work out a couple of years later. They released Popeye the arcade game, which was really cool and pushed technology in a new space. And also they had like a Popeye Game & Watch. So they did land that eventually, but it seems like the license just didn't come through, or there was some sort of complication. So basically they just scrubbed the characters out, but kept the situation the same. Big guy, kidnapping lady, smaller guy has to go save him on a construction site. That's a classic Popeye gag, like running around the construction site to stop Brutus or Bluto or whichever version of that character you prefer. You end up with Donkey Kong in place of Bluto. You end up with Pauline or Lady in place of Olive Oil, and you end up with Jumpman or Mario in place of Popeye. And so they put together this game concept that could use the radar scope technology and be like these boards could be inserted into the machine, no problem. Labels could go over the side of the board, all as well. And that's kind of how Popeye came to be. But, in recent years, more granular details have come to light. Probably 15 years ago, I think it became evident to people on the English-speaking side of the internet, thanks to folks like Frank Cifaldi at the Video Game History Foundation, that Nintendo didn't program Donkey Kong themselves. They worked with an outside contractor, Ikegami Tsushinki. They're still around. They make cameras and things like that. They were a pretty well-established firm. And as with so many companies that wanted to get into video games but didn't necessarily have that expertise, they reached out to Ikegami, who had also done Radar Scope and would continue to do some stuff with them until there was like a falling out over rights to Donkey Kong. And they did the programming on Donkey Kong. Like all the engineering was them. Miyamoto was really kind of the design. And I think within the past year or so, there's been some commentary, and I haven't really vetted this or dug deeply into how legitimate it is, but basically someone who supposedly worked at Ikegami came forward and said on social media, yeah, actually they brought us these design docs and we helped refine them and fine-tune how the game played, but also it was just this one level, and we said there needs to be more than this. So supposedly levels 2, 3, and 4 of Donkey Kong were not really designed at Nintendo, but were just kind of extrapolations by Ikegami's engineers and programmers to build on the foundation of that first girder level and create like a more fleshed out, robust game. Again, like I said, I haven't vetted that, so I don't want to get out here and say, oh yeah, Miyamoto's a fraud. Nothing like that. Just that, like, it was a collaborative effort for sure. And a lot of the it seems like a lot of the actual design work of Donkey Kong was by the people who programmed it and did the mechanical work on the boards, which was often the case with video games back in the days when 3 people would make a video game. So there's nothing scandalous about that. It's just, oh, that's interesting to learn about. This very, very important game kind of resulted from an attempt to create something with someone else's property, and that failed. And then the engineers said, let's make it even better. This kind of collaborative evolution of a property.
How was it received in the U.S.?
Oh, it was a huge hit. I'm old enough that I remember it. And I remember the first time I saw Donkey Kong in arcades, and I was barely tall enough my eyes were at joystick level. So looking up, it was godlike. Here's this ape or gorilla glaring down at me. And it did seem like a truly Herculean effort to climb those girders and reach the top. It was, I think, the biggest hit this side of Pac-Man. Like, Pac-Man was runaway the number 1 hit of the time. And Donkey Kong came along a little less than a year later, and was like number 2 in terms of units sold. Like, people loved it. And it was a massive, massive hit.
What made it stand out across this space? Because I know that there's a whole bunch of junk in the arcades at this point, a lot of copycats. Why is it popping off?
Like you said, a lot of copycats, a lot of original stuff too. This was an era of arcade design where people were just throwing any idea that came to them at the wall and trying to see what stuck. And Donkey Kong felt new and original. It wasn't the first platform game, but it was the first that played the way that it did. Like before this, you had Space Panic, which is just you climbing ladders and digging holes. It's basically like Lode Runner Zero. And Donkey Kong clearly takes notes from Space Panic with the platforms and the ladders, but Mario can jump, and he can also pick up weapons to use to defend himself, but most of the time he's actually defenseless. And so it's a game of avoidance and kind of learning where safe spaces are and learning where you can fight back. And I think also the fact that if you look at games of this era, they were very much clear the board type experiences, and Donkey Kong is too, but those were about like within the space, complete an objective, like Space Panic, dig holes and trap all the aliens, or Galaxian, shoot all the invaders that are on, like in the current wave, and then the next wave comes. Donkey Kong wasn't about that. You don't actually have to fight or destroy anything if you don't want. The point of Donkey Kong is to go from point A to point B. And you can take different paths to get there. There's multiple ladders on the first stage. The second stage with the two elevators, you can take like a high route, a low route. You can take the long route up the ladders to the far side, or you can try to risk it and go along the top, but you have to be mindful of all these obstacles that are flying at you and hazards. So it was challenging, but it presented people with a different kind of objective than I think you really saw before in arcades, which was get to the goal as opposed to destroy all the stuff. And also it had great graphics. It had great sound. There's this dynamic sound chip inside of it that even Nintendo's own emulation on Nintendo Switch Online and Arcade Archives doesn't quite capture. It's like there's like a randomization to the sound that gives Mario's squeaky little feet a distinct noise. And it had characters. You know, it had Mario, it had Lady, and of course it had the main character, or the title character, Donkey Kong. And he was a huge sprite. He had personality. He would beat his chest. My friend Chris Kohler, game historian and journalist, Chris Kohler has pointed out that it was a game with a narrative. And the narrative was simple: save the girl. That was still more than you saw in arcades at that point. So it brought together a lot of things.
When something succeeds in American entertainment, we usually get the rush of merch and tie-ins. How did Nintendo build off the hype?
Oh, if you can name a kind of product, it existed. There was a board game. There were coloring books, sticker books that I had, plush toys. There was a cartoon, Saturday morning cartoon. I believe part of Saturday Supercade with some other... they were all pretty bad, but it was tied around Donkey Kong Jr. There was a cereal, like any and everything you could name. Toys, food, snacks, television. It was out there.
We're going to get into the transition from Donkey Kong to Mario as the face of the brand, but you said in your videos that Donkey Kong is the beginning of the platformer genre. And I think from the average person, people picture Mario when they hear that. How do you explain that?
I mean, in the sense that it's really the first game, or the first game of significance, where you control a character who moves around, and the essential tool in his arsenal is ultimately jumping. In the first level, you're really just climbing and you're jumping to get over barrels and fireballs. Depending on which version of the game you play, there's like a different level order in different versions of it. But what I think of as the second level is the one with the elevators and kind of like a big open space flanking this sort of central platform. And you can't get through that stage without mastering the ability to jump from one space onto a moving object and then onto another object, like another platform. And that's like the foundation of action games in the 1980s and 90s right there, until you went to 3D and you could start to pick up other verbs of action. Platforming was the main thrust of hundreds and hundreds, thousands of games. Donkey Kong was really the first game to get it right. Not the first game that had jumping, but the first game that really, they gave you one button dedicated to jumping, and really forced you to master that. And even within the sandbox of Donkey Kong, you have to use the jump ability in a lot of different ways, not just to avoid enemies. You jump to grab the hammers that you can use as weapons automatically. On the second stage, you're jumping onto elevators that are moving vertically. The famous cement factory stage, or pie factory, if you parse it that way, you have to use jumping really to create momentum against the moving platforms, like the moving sidewalks that are pushing you in one direction. So they did a lot with the concept of jumping just within this one game. So, right from the starting gates, Donkey Kong just created a game that you have to know how to jump. You have to be able to be good at it and use it in a lot of different ways. And it became really sort of the foundation of like an entire genre, or even beyond that, just a category, a section of video games.
People in the US, they know Donkey Kong. They might know Nintendo by proxy. How is Nintendo using Donkey Kong's popularity to leverage the creation and the launch of the NES?
Honestly, that's kind of an interesting question to compare the US launch versus the Japanese launch. At the Japanese launch of the Famicom in 1983, it's just 2 years past arcade Donkey Kong's debut, and there hadn't been a perfect version of the game, really, or even one you could play in Japan on home consoles or home systems. So that was the launch title: Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. Nintendo went with its arcade hits. You fast forward 2.5 years, and game design has evolved a lot on Famicom by that point. And Donkey Kong was not actually available at the original test launch of the NES. Those early games, those 3 Famicom launch titles, didn't show up for like another 9 months. When the system finally went nationwide, you got the Classics series with Donkey Kong Jr. and Popeye and Mario Brothers. But at the NES launch, it was really focused around Rob, the robot operating buddy, and the Zapper light gun, and kind of the big sort of like, hey, look at this game, was Kung Fu. And Super Mario Brothers was there at the launch, but it came in hot. The Japanese launch of Super Mario Brothers was like less than a month before the test launch in the US of the NES. So they basically like shoved that into some cartridges and got it over here. And I don't know that it was a proven, like they could trust it to be a big hit. It was very different from the other NES games. Much bigger, more sprawling, challenging in a different way that wasn't like pure arcade design. That was in Japan the zenith of Famicom design. It was the culmination of more than 2 years of console releases. You went from these very simple arcade ports to increasingly complex games. And then in the autumn of 1985, suddenly here's Super Mario Brothers. It just kind of blows away everything else on the system, anything else available for any other home console at the time in terms of scope, visuals, sound, secrets, complexity. Like, it was a revelation. That's what Nintendo started the NES with, really. Like, it pretty quickly, they said, we need to pack this in with the system. So you got the action set that didn't come with Rob or Zapper. It came with Mario, Super Mario Brothers. So Donkey Kong kind of immediately became, to put a pun on it, sort of second banana. It became like a lesser game in a way. It was definitely a familiar title. It was a game where for parents or older kids to say, oh yeah, I loved this game a few years ago. But at the same time, I don't know, for me, it was kind of a hard sell. Like, I played it on Coleco. I'd played it in arcades. I'd seen Donkey Kong a lot. So when it came out on NES, yes, that version was closer to the arcade in terms of visuals and structure and design, but I wanted to play Super Mario Brothers because it was new and fresh and very exciting. It was revolutionary. So I think immediately Donkey Kong took a back seat. And from this point on, you don't see new Donkey Kong stuff. June 1986, you get Donkey Kong Jr. and Donkey Kong 3 released for NES. And then the next original Donkey Kong game happens in 1994.
After the rise of Mario, this very fast rise, we get one more version of the original Donkey Kong, this time for the Game Boy. What makes this version so special?
So yeah, this showed up just a couple of months before Donkey Kong Country in 1994, so nearly a decade after the NES launched. And I think at this point, the idea of a port of Donkey Kong, the arcade game, to Game Boy is okay, that's fine. But if you actually take the time to play it, beyond those first 4 stages, you discover that there's like another 100 levels to the game. And it becomes this intricate puzzle game that is built around the Mario vocabulary that was created in the original Donkey Kong of climbing ladders and jumping. But also, they're kind of using this game as a playground with which to experiment for Mario's moveset for Mario 64. And you don't necessarily realize it at first, because why would you think, oh, I should try double jumping in Donkey Kong? You just play it straightforward. But as the game expands, you start to have to use Mario's like ability to do a jump, a higher jump, and then a triple jump, it's like a flipping jump. And if you've played Mario 64, you've done that. But Donkey Kong 94 sort of rolls that out steadily. And then you can go back to the opening levels, the 4 levels that are taken from Donkey Kong, the arcade game, and you can use all of those powers there. And once you realize you can do that, you can clear the first level in like 5 seconds. You can just flip your way up to the top, and it's crazy. But that's the thing, is it throws a swerve at you. You don't have any reason to go into this thinking like this is Donkey Kong but reinvented with the modern Mario style, the upcoming Mario style. It's just so much more game than you would have expected. And again, it really is like a groundbreaking take on Mario, because it's experimenting with his moveset that would happen like 2 years later with Mario 64. So it's this really cool kind of landmark in video games. But really, it's called Donkey Kong, but it's really all about Mario. The thing that makes this game interesting is Mario. And that kind of, I think, embodies what the divide in this property. Like, everyone was kind of like, you always play as Mario. You never play as Donkey Kong. But that would come a couple of months later with Donkey Kong Country.
Let's take a quick break. And when we get back, Donkey Kong Country and the strange evolution of the series. As we've discussed, Donkey Kong has been all but disrespected. How did Donkey Kong evolve into Donkey Kong Country, and how did Rareware get trusted with really the breakout IP for Nintendo?
Yeah, Nintendo, I think, struggled to figure out what to do with Donkey Kong. In the early issues of Nintendo Power and the associated books that they published, they teased for like a year or two a game called Return of Donkey Kong. And they were like, it's coming soon, but it was always coming soon, and then it just disappeared. And no one knows what that is. People have asked Howard Phillips, the kind of like the guy at Nintendo who was really tuned in to video games and product design. And he's like, I don't know what that was. So who knows what the plan was? But that's the thing, is like Mario was created as a sort of everyman, and the original plan was to make him do any and everything. They kind of eventually sort of landed on Mario as the character you play as in Super Mario Brothers. But Donkey Kong, they never figured out. Like, he's the antagonist in the first game. He's a victim in the Donkey Kong Jr. He's the antagonist again, and you have to shoot him with bug spray in the butt in Donkey Kong 3. But, like, he was so big, and what do you do with this character? They just never figured it out. So I think, they trusted Rare to figure it out for them and to make something interesting. Rare had a really special relationship with Nintendo. They were the first Western studio, like outside of Japan, to develop for the NES. And that's because they recognized really early on in the Famicom era, like, this is going to be a thing. This is a really cool system. And they figured out on their own how to program for it.
Yeah.
As early as 1987, I want to say, their first game comes out, Slalom, which is a really cool racing game with a 3D effect. And Rare was there at the forefront of the NES. They were making technically groundbreaking games like Battletoads and RC Pro-Am. It was just mind-blowing in terms of what they were doing with the hardware. They were also keeping the lights on in the studio by just doing workaday jobs for other people. Like Nintendo hired Ikegami to create Donkey Kong. Everyone was hiring Rare to create their games. And outside of the mysterious Japanese studio Tosei, I believe no one created more games for NES or Famicom than Rare. They produced like 60 games for the system, most of them under other people's labels, but they made like WWF WrestleMania, Wizards and Warriors. They put together all kinds of Muppet games, and they would even subcontract stuff out to trusted sub-developers. Like for the Sesame Street education games, those were contracted to Rare, and then Rare was like, yeah, we don't want to do these. So they gave them to Zippo Games or studios like that. And Nintendo and Rare, I think, just developed a relationship as a result of that. I mean, the earliest Rare games for NES were published as first-party titles. When it came to technical innovation and just making good, solid, reliable games, Nintendo knew it could trust Rare. Japanese business is so much about relationships and about who you trust and who you know, and proven work and track records. I think Rare was the natural fit. Like of any studio, Rare was the obvious choice to give this sort of lodestone, cornerstone, really, of Nintendo's business to say, make him good again. And so that's where you get Donkey Kong Country.
What makes this series so popular?
Yeah, at the time that Donkey Kong Country came out at the end of 1994, video games were definitely moving in the direction of 3D. Like at that point, Sega Saturn and PlayStation were out in Japan or were imminent any day. You could play 3D games in arcades, Virtua Racer or Ace Combat or whatever. It was pretty clear that video games were going into the third dimension. Nintendo had been teasing Ultra 64, Project Reality, whatever they were calling it at that point. Nintendo was going in that direction too. But at the same time, they still needed to juice some more life out of the Super NES and coax some more profit from that before they moved on to their next console, because it was taking a while. And it was possible to do 3D on NES with the FX chip and the FX2, but it was pretty rough. Like, they could have done 3D polygons on Super NES, 12 frames per second, 20 triangles on the screen. But instead, Rare said, what if we faked 3D? What if we did all the 3D work on our end, and then on the console, it's just working with 2D assets? So they sat down with a massive selection of Silicon Graphics workstations and put together a game with 3D assets, but instead of taking those 3D polygons into the Super NES and coming up with something that looked terrible, they rendered them into bitmap art and then saved that data to the cartridge. So really, Donkey Kong Country is just a 2D platformer like any other, but they did an amazing job of taking those high detail, light sourced, complex geometry models and backgrounds and bringing those into the NES or Super NES and creating the illusion of a game that it was like theatrical quality 3D, even though it was just 2D. And the illusion sells a lot better on the TVs that were prevalent at the time, CRTs. When you look at it on a very crisp LCD screen, the illusion kind of falls apart, and Donkey Kong Country is kind of messy looking. But on a CRT, there's a lot of natural blending and just variation in lighting and color from the nature of the analog technology. And so that kind of just smoothed over the obvious seams and created a dazzling looking game. And the artists at Rare did a great job with the environments, like the tree village, the ice stages. Obviously, there's a minecart stage. This is like the primal minecart stage. If you hate minecart stages, look back to Donkey Kong Country. I blame that game. But everything looked great. It all fit together. It was very cohesive. And also, it introduced the idea of the collectathon in video games. That sort of like teasing your obsessive compulsive tendencies. I mean, there were always games that were like about, percentage completion. Metroid at the end, or Super Metroid, when you completed it, it would say, hey, good job, you got 63% of stuff. And it just kind of left it to you to figure out what's up with the other 37. And Donkey Kong turned that into a core mechanic and then kind of juiced it a little bit. So you actually have to end up getting like 103% or something. Each stage kind of gave you an indication of, is it complete? Have you found everything? It really encouraged players to seek out and find everything and replay the game and explore all the nooks and crannies. And on top of that, they could play it with another person. It was kind of the full package. And on top of that, it made Donkey Kong playable for the first time. Amazing.
So we get 3 of these in a very, very short window of time, tremendously popular. And yet, here we are on a podcast all these years later saying, wow, they didn't make Donkey Kong games for a very long time. How does it disappear again?
Once you get into the N64 era, I think a lot of legacy franchises start to slow down. You look at PlayStation and 64, you do have games that are just iterating annually, like Tomb Raider. But a lot of the other series hit the brakes, and the developers start to take longer to make each game more significant. I want to say Donkey Kong Country 3 came out in 96, and I believe in 2000, maybe it's 1999, 2000. So a few years later, you get Donkey Kong 64, but that one embodied all the worst trends that Donkey Kong Country kicked off in the first place. And it just feels excessive. There's a bunch of characters, there's a ton of secrets, but it lacked the spark. We'd already seen that with Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Spyro the Dragon, tons of other platform action games. Donkey Kong 64 didn't really bring anything new to the table. So they didn't stop making Donkey Kong games, but the nature of the games shifted, and Donkey Kong stopped being a marquee player, and he actually became the character that Nintendo had originally visualized Mario as. Like, this guy you could slot into pretty much any kind of game you wanted. And if you look at the games of the early 2000s that starred Donkey Kong, you have Jungle Beat, which is a Mario-style action platform game that is controlled entirely with bongo drums, which had been introduced with a rhythm game as the instrument to control that. But they said, we can also let you play a video game with these drums. And it shouldn't work, but it does. And that's actually kind of like the foundation of the Mario Galaxy team. So they sort of experimented with Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, and Nintendo management was like, wow, you guys, that was really good. You should make the next Mario. You have the Game Boy games. Like they took Donkey Kong 94 and they turned that into the Mario versus Donkey Kong series. And there's like several thousand of those at this point, and they're all repetitive. But then you also have the sort of experimental peg platform games. There was one for Game Boy Advance and one for DS. King of Swing and Jungle Climber.
So during this time, we get so many of these experimental things. We eventually do get a pseudo return to the Donkey Kong Country style of games. And then that also is short-lived, and there's a large gap. And now we're in 2025, and Nintendo has actually decided to give Donkey Kong not just the big AAA experience, but make it a console launch moment. The first true game that they've made since arguably the original Donkey Kong games. The first in the series that they've made since Donkey Kong Jungle Beat in 2004. But first real big Donkey Kong game.
Like the non-country games?
Yeah, and that they themselves have made, that they're not passing over to rent anybody else.
Internally at Nintendo. Yeah, like the portable games were developed by Pion, and Donkey Kong Country Returns was by Retro Studios.
Yeah, so it's actually them making the game, and it's a AAA game. Why do you think Nintendo has, after literally decades, returned to Donkey Kong and given the character this big moment?
Certainly it's been time. It's been well past time. I think they just wanted to do something new and different. I think also, if you look at the dynamic between Kong and Pauline, it looks like they looked at Wreck-It Ralph and were like, Wreck-It Ralph is totally riffing on Donkey Kong. We should just take that back. It's the whole like Prince of Persia, Lara Croft, Indiana Jones, like this kind of cycle of borrowing from one another, throw Uncharted in there. it kind of feels like you had Fix-It Felix Jr., the arcade game that was straight up like a Donkey Kong homage. And Nintendo kind of said, yeah, let's do that. So, they're kind of building on that. But also, if you look back to this team's previous game, it was Super Mario Odyssey. And that was actually Donkey Kong was kind of conspicuous in his absence, because you get to New Donk City, which is named after Donkey Kong. And there's like this whole musical celebration of Mario's origins with Pauline, the singing mayor. And it kind of raises the question of like, how come Donkey Kong's not actually in this? This is all like you see like imagery, you hear his name, but it's going back to Mario's roots minus Kong himself. So I feel like it was just them saying, we actually need to do something with this guy. But I also think they wanted to wait until they could do something different and interesting, and the technology was there to support it. Nintendo, they will take an idea and say, well, this is cool, but it doesn't quite work yet. We don't have the tech for it. Like Mario should have been riding a dinosaur, their sketches for like the original Super Mario Brothers, I think. And they didn't bring that out until Super NES, because that was when it was finally possible for Mario to, on the tech level, to convincingly ride a dinosaur around. So this game, Bonanza, is very much about destroying environments and voxels and stuff. And they've shown comparisons of how it would look on the original Switch versus Switch 2. And on Switch, it could have played, but it would have been barren and hollow and empty. Whereas on Switch 2, it's just like there's stuff everywhere. It's such densely packed environments, so visually cluttered in a good way. Like not a, I can't tell what's going on. Just, I've got this entire world that I can just tear to pieces and I'm going to do it. So I think they were just biding their time to bring back Donkey Kong, and they could really make it count and do something significant with the character, as opposed to just continuing to make more Mario versus Donkey Kong games and just keep iterating on some tired, stale ideas. This is not just Donkey Kong Country in 3D. We've already seen that. It was Donkey Kong 64, and it was fine, but it wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't inspiring. Whereas I haven't had a chance to play Bonanza yet. I have it. I just haven't had time because it's only been a few days. The response that I've seen on social media has just been almost unanimously glowing. People love it. People are really having a great time with it. And I think Nintendo is in a position now where they can afford, they've got so many different revenue streams and they're always cranking it, like just churning up money. They can afford to sit back and say, all right, now's the time to bring this guy out again. Now's the time to kind of make our mark. We've got the tech, the audience is ready, game design concepts are ready. Like we can finally go with this.
Act 3, the news of the week. Y'all, I'll be real with you, we are so deep into the nothingness of summer video game time. Not much is happening. I mean, there's the little stuff here and there. Supergiant is now swearing that Hades 2's new update will be the last one before the game leaves early access. To which I say, okay. I mean, if you want to keep adding more stuff, that's totally fine too. There was a new Pokemon released this week, which would seem really exciting, but it's a free-to-play game. Even calling it a free-to-play game is kind of a stretch. You should plan on spending $9.99 if you want to enjoy this thing. Which you might. It's perfectly fine. And there was a big leak, followed by a trailer for a new Battlefield game, Battlefield 6, that seems to have impossible expectations already set for it. If I sound a bit blah about all of this, well, I guess it's just the blah time of the year. And yet, I do have some good news, something that I think can really bring the energy back to the room. And that is Wheel World, released this week by the same developer as Nidhogg and Flywrench, two absolutely killer indie games. Wheel World is a game about being on a bike, racing against elite bike teams in a floating skull wrapped in blue and ethereal terror. It's pretty cool. and you should check it out. That's the thing about video games. Even the blah weeks, they still have their good moments. And that is the news of the... Remember when I said it was kind of a blah week? And I was like, kind of whatever, no big news? Well, I was wrong. And frankly, I wish I had been right, because the news sucks. Here's what happened. Late Wednesday night, itch.io, arguably the best open marketplace for independent game creators, de-indexed all adult/NSFW content. This is horrible, and you might think makes no sense. If you listen to our episode on adult and sex and lewd games, you might remember that the guest, Hot Pink, talked about itch.io as being somewhat of a sanctuary for NSFW content. Well, basically, credit card companies put the screws on them, and an organization called Collective Shout put the screws on the credit card companies. Let me explain. Collective Shout is an Australian group that claims to be a, quote, grassroots campaign movement against the objectification of women and the sexualization of girls. So what do? They build a campaign where they contact credit card companies and say, Visa, MasterCard, your cards are being used to transfer money between people who are making this horrible, evil, nefarious content. And it can start small. We actually saw this just a few weeks ago when Steam began to remove some of its not safe for work content. Mostly really taboo stuff, things involving the depiction of rape or incest. But the movement continues to expand far beyond those reaches. And so we have what happened to itch.io. You see, itch.io has a much smaller team than Steam. It doesn't have Valve's powerful legal apparatus, nor does it have a financial war chest. And it has to move quickly because you see, the credit cards, the payment processors, they will say, basically, if you want everything on itch.io to be able to continue to be sold, you need to remove the content we deem nefarious, and you need to do it now. And that results in all adult and not safe for work content being removed in effectively the blink of an eye. itch.io has said that they are auditing the content, that they are trying to create systems where developers can get their material back onto the site, but some damage is done. And the damage isn't just done to people who make games about sexual behavior that many people will find grotesque. And it doesn't just impact not safe for work games featuring sexy content that most people like. It affects games that are far outside these bounds. You remember the very first episode of Post Games, in which we talked to Jenny Zhao Jia and A.P. Thompson about their IGF winning game, Consume Me. It was delisted as part of this action. A game about a teenage girl battling the way society objectifies and sexualizes her body, pressuring her into disordered eating. The thing that, in theory, Collective Shout would support, it has been removed. So too have games by one of my absolute favorite game developers, Robert Yang, who does make sexy games. And they are also art. And if they were just sexy games, that would be fine too. It sucks. It is scary for the many developers who no longer know how they will get paid. And in this moment politically, it is yet another disturbing shift towards puritanism that is anti-art, that is anti-creativity, and that is anti-humanity. And that is the news of the week. Next week, prepare to die, video games about death. It sounds dark. I swear you're going to come out of this one feeling good. Most games, they let you kill and die, but a new crop of games are about death. What sort of person wants to make these? And why do I often feel better about living after I play them? Game writer Caitlin Tremblay has built a career by writing games on death. From The Mortician's Tale, which lets you experience the role of a mortician firsthand, to the upcoming Ambrosia Sky, which has, honestly, just the best elevator pitch. It's a game about the people who clean up mass death events, and the mechanics blend System Shock with Power Wash Simulator. And somehow it's actually quite sensitive and beautiful, too. This conversation, it meant a lot to me, and was exactly what I needed in these grim times. I can't wait to share it with you. But you know what time it is. Time to say goodbye. A reminder, Post Games supporters get the show and the newsletter early on Fridays at 5 p.m. Eastern, sometimes earlier. They get extra acts and bonus materials. This week, Patreon listeners got Jeremy Parish's top 5 Donkey Kong games, and also his recommendation, is that what we should call it, of the strangest Donkey Kong game. It's a doozy. Plus, each month, Patreon supporters get a video in my ongoing series, Video Game Journalism 101. The 3rd episode goes live very soon, at the beginning of August, and it is about preview culture, one of the weirdest parts of video games journalism, honestly, for its entire existence. And, of course, no ads on anything. Subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/postgames. Subscribe to the newsletter for free at post.games. Post Games logo by James Barham. Theme by Mark Sparling. And a special thank you to this week's guest, Jeremy Parish. And very last thing, if you like the show, please consider sharing it with a friend, leaving a review. Still early days. Still intend to make this show my full-time thing, but we've got some road ahead of us, and I'm excited to travel it with you. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next week.